So this organism is very different than this organism. And I think you said you had all seen or touched dogs. Is there anybody who has not seen or touched a dog? Do I have to assign homework? No? Everybody's seen and touched a dog. Do dogs vary in size? Yeah. Are there little teeny tiny dogs? Yeah, my neighbor does rescue for little miniature dogs. They've always got like extra little tiny dogs. Are there gigantic dogs? Yeah. They vary tremendously in size. Do they have sharp teeth? Well, so far you haven't told me anything that means that this couldn't be a dog. It's not. They've got different traits. And I don't know enough about the biology of that particular early mammal, but I'm going to guess that the structure of their skull is different, that we could look at their bones and we could see differences in the number of bones or how their bones are arranged. With mammals, we actually do a lot of identification from skulls. And if you take zoology, I think Mrs. Speece does a unit on skull ID, and you can get out a trunk of different kinds. Who here has ever found a skull out in the woods? It's kind of cool, And if you walk around in the woods long enough, you'll find bones and skulls, because guess what? Stuff dies out there, and it just lays down and rots, and you find the bones later. And you can identify what kind of animal it was by its skull. So I would guess that there are some significant structural differences in the skull of that little shrew-like mammal and the skull of our dog. Well, really, what we're saying is that they have different traits. And all evolution really is a shift in the distribution of traits and the genes that cause those traits within a population. And this is something that we noted in the video that you watched, that when you accumulate enough tiny differences over a long enough time, that can end up leading to major difference. So really that's the big idea here, and this is what's called the modern synthesis of biological evolution, that evolution is just a shift in gene frequencies in populations. We're going to get to that. And that is something that is very explicitly addressed on the air test. So it's something that I want you to understand. And remember, this is the tea kettle. Okay? We don't know who or why. What we can describe in scientific terms is how. So science can't address who or why. Science cannot give you the meaning of life. What science can address is the physical, stepwise process that we see. Okay? And when we break it down to the scientific level, what we are really talking about is a change in how frequently a gene appears in a population, how frequently a trait appears in a population, and in how traits change over time. It's a normal distribution. So how is any trait distributed in a population? Well, most often it's normal. Most often the distribution of any trait in a population, if you measure enough members of the population, will show a normal distribution. And somebody said yesterday it looks like a bell. It is sometimes called a bell curve because it does look a little bit like a bell. So on this bell curve, where is the majority of the population for any given trait? In the middle. The great average majority. Most of us are average on most things. And you can be average in one trait and not average in another. I am average height. I am below average pinky length. Oh well, I got stubby hands. You can be above average in height and below average in leg length. That is someone we say is tall when they're sitting down. Somebody who's long-waisted and short-legged. You can exist anywhere on this spectrum. And for any trait, the smallest number of individuals tends to be at these extreme ends. Think about height. How many adults do you know who are 3 feet tall or less? Very few. Are there adults who are 3 feet tall or less? Yeah, there are. There are people who have different forms of medical dwarfism. There are individuals who are missing parts of their legs through some sort of birth trauma or birth accident. There are people who, at adult height, are 3 feet or less. There aren't very many of them. How many adults do you know who are 8 feet tall? I know none. Are there adults who are 8 feet tall? Yeah, a few. They're Guinness record holders. And very often those are folks who have a medical condition which causes that kind of extreme height. The guy, I don't know if he's still the world record holder. He was the world record holder for the world's tallest man. And he had a pituitary tumor. So the pituitary gland is in your brain, and it releases hormones that control growth, among other things. And there was a tumor on his pituitary gland which continued to release growth hormone in excessive rates. And he had other medical issues because of it, because your body isn't really well adapted to grow that fast or that tall. And I think he died fairly young because it had an impact on his overall health. But I think he topped out at like over 8 feet tall. He was enormous. He's in a minority. He probably never looked another human being in the eye when he was standing up. Most of us exist for most traits in the great, vast, average middle. It's okay to be average. It's also okay to be out on the ends for one trait or another. Is every trait always distributed this way? No. Matter of fact, it's not. And what evolution does, what evolution really is the environment changing the distribution of those traits. So these two top distributions are called skewed distributions, and your notes here mean nothing if you do not draw a picture. If you write down just the words here, your notes literally are useless. So skewed distributions mean that high point is towards one end or the other. It means that most people, most rabbits, most goldfish, most earthworms, most whatever species and organism we're talking about, exist at one end or another. And we can have things that are skewed to either side. We can have things, and I forget the math terms for negative and positive. Is it negative and positive skew? Right and left skew? Okay, and that's why I forget it, because I can't tell right from left reliably. So the minute I hear right and left, I just stop listening. I finally have admitted that as an adult. I just stopped listening. So yeah, there's right and left skew, though don't ask me which is which. Chase will tell you that if we need to deal with that. He'll handle it. But we have populations where some characteristic has a larger number of people who are at the low end or the high end of that value. We also have this distribution, and a few of you saw this. So the mode, remember, is the number that appeared what? Most often. So some of you had no mode, and some of you had a distribution that had 2 modes. I know there was one group that had a distribution with 2 modes. Is that you guys? When you have a distribution with 2 modes, you most often get a graph that looks something like this. It's got 2 humps. It's a bi means how many? 2. It's a bimodal distribution, because there are 2 areas where you have most of your individuals. So, when the environment causes pressure and it changes the distribution of some trait, that's when we're ripe for evolution to happen, when the distribution of a trait gets changed. Another way that we can talk about evolution and distribution of traits is we can look at gene frequency. So the traits that we were measuring yesterday, we said there are 2 sources of variation. What are they? Give me one, Tyler.
There's the environment.
There's the environment, yeah. What else, Garrett? Yeah, what you inherit, your genes. So we could take someone who has all the genes to be 6'2". and raise them in a situation where they're not receiving enough calories, and guess what's going to, are they going to be 6'2"? Are they going to meet their potential? Probably not. Similarly, we could take somebody who's got the genetic makeup to be pretty average height. Well, they'll, I guess that's a bad example. If we take two people who have the genetic potential to be really tall, and we have one of them getting all their nutritional needs met and one of them not, they're not going to reach the same height. So there are environmental influences on what we see. There's a fantastic, it's a horrible example, but from a scientific perspective, we can look at it and go, wow. When do you guys get World War II history? Do you get any World War II history in the high school?
I'm sure we're still on World War I.
World Studies, you do some World War II history? Okay. When did World War II end, approximately? Give me a rough...
About 45, I think.
Yeah. I think the treaties were signed in Europe in late 44, and the war in Japan, well, we dropped the atomic bomb on Japan in August of 45. So in Europe, the war was essentially over somewhere in 1944, late 1944. The winter of 1944 into 1945 in Holland was called the Starving Winter. So Europe had just been through years and years and years of war. It had destroyed roads and warehouses and transportation, and every resource that anyone had gone to the war effort. People were homeless, their homes had been destroyed, they had, it was horrible. Agricultural fields had been bombed or mined. This is still a big deal in France. Farmers die in France every year because there are still landmines in fields. There are whole areas of the French countryside that are sort of off limits because they were mined during the war. And so you can't farm them, you can't go hiking there. It's a big issue. So in Holland, during the winter of 1944 to 45, there was so little food available for people. They call it the starving winter for a reason. There were women who carried babies through that winter who lost weight during their pregnancies. I don't think any of you have been pregnant, but I can tell you that you have to work to not gain, you naturally gain weight during a pregnancy because there is a developing human inside the body, and that human is putting on weight. And so if you're even partially meeting your own nutritional needs, you're going to gain weight because you're building in a whole other human being. It's pretty amazing, actually, as a process. There were women who carried infants to term and lost weight, meaning that their bodies were starving themselves. The infants were not, the fetus and then infant was not getting what it needed. Hundreds of thousands, I don't know the numbers. A lot of people died. People starved to death. Children went hungry. People were eating sawdust soup. People were eating rats. People were eating anything they could find. It was the worst kind of possible horror you can imagine. People who came through that, who had siblings who were born to the same biological parents several years later, saw tremendous differences in growth. So you could have a kid who was born in 43, who was an infant or a small child during the starving winter, who had a sibling 5 years younger than them, by which time Europe was rebuilding and there was food and there was the Marshall Plan. We had friends in Germany. My parents had a friend, and she would have been a small child during the war, and she could not drink milk as an adult. She said, I can't drink milk. I can only drink it with chocolate. I smell milk and I want to throw up, because they had powdered milk. She was Greek, I think. And Maria said after the war, it was so hard to make sure you had enough food for your kids. And the Marshall Plan was a U.S. aid plan that provided basically food resources to Europeans. And she said, one of the only reliable sources of protein that her mother had for the kids was the powdered milk that came from the Marshall Plan. And she said, we drank as much milk as my mom could get in us, because it was the only reliable source of protein she had for 3 or 4 growing kids. And she said, I cannot tolerate milk because the powdered milk was so awful. And she said, I can only drink milk with chocolate. And this was an adult, remembering back. So by the late 40s, there were more resources for people. You can look at siblings born to the same parents 5 years apart, and there are tremendous differences in where they end up, in whether or not they meet their genetic potential, because the environment does play a big role. It's an interplay of your genes and your environment. Okay, but the underlying genes, how often a particular gene appears in a population, is really the heart of evolution. So we can have all those environmental influences, but if a gene is favored or not, and how often that gene appears, is really the heart of evolution, because it drives it drives a lot of the change in traits. We will look more at gene frequency when we get into genetics and when we get into things like the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. But for now, you should know that evolution is, we said it's a shift in traits over populations. It's also a shift in gene frequency over generation. When there is a gene that gives you an advantage, I guess I have these pictures reversed, don't I? When there's a gene that gives you an advantage, it becomes more common in the population. When there's a gene that's harmful, it usually becomes less common. So when there's a gene that is helpful, that offers an advantage, it generally becomes more common. When there's a gene that's harmful, it usually becomes less common. A gene, oops, I don't need to do that. A gene is just a section of DNA. That's all a gene is. It's a little chunk of DNA. Most of our bluegill fall into that great average middle, and we have a few individuals who are, somewhat exceptional. And then we have a few individuals with, really tiny tails or really crazy long tails. And let's assume for a moment that tail length is controlled by a single gene. And that if you have a copy of this gene, you have a tail that falls in this range. So we'll call it the tail gene. But a copy of this gene that gives you this really kind of perfect sized tail is there. Yeah. So we're looking at this, and we would expect that this tail gene, let's see. We would expect that this tail gene exists, in some sort of middle-of-the-road portion of the population. Maybe half the population at any given time has this tail gene, and this great big chunk of them live in this sort of average tail zone. Well, what if suddenly whatever this gene is became, and let's say if you don't have this gene, your tail gets shorter. So what if over time we saw a shift, and we don't know why we would see this shift, but we saw a shift and suddenly it started to look more like this. So what had been that average middle, suddenly we have a lot more individuals down in this range. And we said having if you don't have the tail gene, you get a short tail. If you have the tail gene, your tail is longer or more average. If you don't have the tail gene, you get a short tail. What happened to the tail the frequency of the tail gene in this population. Did it increase or decrease? Oh. It's likely that if we looked at that gene, we would see that fewer individuals had it. Now, do none of them have it? No, there are still some that have average tails, have longer tails. But fewer of them seem to have it now. We've seen a shift in a trait, and we've seen a shift in the underlying gene that controls for that trait. That's all evolution really is. Okay, we're going to stop there. Individuals don't evolve. That's really important. You personally cannot evolve biologically. Now you can say, well, my view on that has evolved, or I think my style has evolved. I think my art has really evolved in the last year. Yeah, that's true. But you don't biologically evolve. You grow, you change, you develop over a lifetime. But whatever genes you were born with are the genes you keep. Your genetic makeup doesn't change over your life. We could take a DNA test on the day you were born and take a DNA test on your 100th birthday. You're going to have the same genes. I keep throwing in dogs. That's the literary device would be foreshadowing. We're foreshadowing that there's something coming up with dogs. It's a cute little Rottweiler. Adorable puppies. Big, probably 90-pound lap dog there by the end. So whatever genes you're born with are the genes you keep. Therefore, your gene frequency can't change. You either have the gene, it's 100%, or you don't, it's 0%. Or no, there's nothing in the middle. Okay. That's where we'll stop.